I was going to ask you as a follow-up question before you gave that answer. I was going to ask you what advice you would give to someone earlier in their career who are still trying to figure things out. Maybe you just answered that question.
Yeah, hold on to your soul, brothers and sisters.
Welcome to That Pivotal Moment of Change, the podcast that's not about what you do, but how you got to where you are. Let's dive into the twists, the turns, and defining moments that shape our careers. This debut episode features Bob Schwartz, a trailblazing design leader who boldly leaped from the corporate world to revolutionize education at Mount Mary University. Packed with eye-opening insights on finding your passion, fearless leadership, networking like a pro, taking hits, and standing strong in your values, Bob's journey is a must-listen for anyone ready to make bold moves in their career.
Hey, Bob, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here and part of the show. You are actually guest number one, so I'm super excited to talk to you today.
An honor.
Okay, so let's start off with what you were up to at Mount Mary University.
So Mount Mary University is 111 years old. It was founded on a platform of social justice to educate immigrant women in poverty. Who was doing that then? Who's doing that now? At any rate, that platform of social justice persists to today. And this is an amazing women's university, although men are in the graduate programs, where there's 19 languages spoken. There's 11 faith areas, including no faith, even paganism, if somebody chooses. There's 15 distinct cultures. We are a Hispanic serving institution with a 45% Hispanic serving women. We have a Hmong community and many, many, many others. This was very attractive to me, in particular because of the social justice platform. I knew Mount Mary from my time at GE Healthcare because we actually did some work with them and taught them about design thinking. I had been at GE Healthcare for a little over 12 years. The company was what I would like to say, giving out shiny red balloons. And one came my way. I had given out a few. What I'm imagining is it was preparation for the company to break up, as it's done now. I don't know that for a fact. I imagined that. At any rate, one came my way and I took it. I had no idea what I wanted to do next. In fact, I took some time off to think about that. And ultimately, I set up 3 profiles on Indeed.com, one academic, one corporate, and one consultant, just to kind of see what would happen. And the very first thing that popped up was the opportunity to be Dean of the Schools of Arts, Design, and Business at Mount Mary University. I was also talking to some corporate folks and consulting friends that I had. I was actually working pretty hard on one such thing and another in a healthcare system. But ultimately, the short story was I decided that this was my calling and where I wanted to shine my light and see how I could be helpful to these diverse young women, most of whom are first in their family to go to college, many immigrants or immigrant families, many on federal Pell Grants, about 67, 70%, and all those challenges. And it was a place where I felt like I could do meaningful work and bring what I know. So that's how I chose to do that. I've always been involved in academic things all throughout my career, sponsoring projects, lecturing, oftentimes with companies' money, and that was the best part. But I always found that rewarding. I've had faculty appointments at University of Cincinnati and Northwestern University. So it wasn't foreign to me. Doing it full time was a whole nother step in a new direction.
And you kind of just answered one of my follow-up questions, because what I was going to ask you is, after just a great design career and some high-profile brands, thinking about what was next, one of the things you decided that you're going to set up a profile for was academia.
People who know me for a long time have heard me talk about this for 25 years. Someday I'd like to teach or be involved in giving back. What's the next generation look like at that time? Hopefully I've accumulated some wisdom and maybe some stupidity too along the way. I don't know. The people that I talked to when I was wrestling with, I got this corporate opportunity in healthcare again, and I have this thing over here, in this interesting university, very unique place. They really got on my case, and a few of them kicked my ass and said, Schwartz, you've been talking about this for 25 years. What is wrong with you? So I jumped off the edge of the earth and I did that. And I'm at a place in my life where I can do something like this. My kids are long off the payroll. I saved a little money, and this is a very rewarding direction I've taken.
So let's go back a little bit further and talk about what got you into design early on.
I do have to go back to earlier in my life. I grew up in a family where my mother was very creative. She was actually a comedy writer. She wrote for some very famous comedians and entertainers. My dad was a developer. His father was a developer. They didn't call it that back then. My mother's father was a watchmaker, and he made jewelry, and just a very creative DNA pool that I came from. And so I always grew up doing things with my hands, getting into mischief because I had this imaginary mind. And even in elementary school and in middle school, I lived in the art room. I loved it. And there were a few teachers who took an interest in my interest and helped to encourage me, as did my parents. In high school, I started to understand that the things I was doing were about this stuff called design, even though I was doing a lot of art stuff. And ultimately, I chose to go to art design school and went to the Kansas City Art Institute for undergrad. And I actually, at that time, declared my major as sculpture because I couldn't sell out to the man and go into something like design. But that was the time we were in. I was a long-haired hippie, and that was just the way it was. I lasted 2 weeks in the sculpture department and realized where I really needed to be was in design, and I transferred and never looked back. Followed that on, I went to Rhode Island School of Design and got a master's degree in industrial design, and did some really fascinating work for the American Red Cross that they had funded, and that led to a 12-year career stint at their national headquarters. So that's kind of the nickel tour of how I found my way.
You have a really impressive background in terms of design and design leadership. Could you talk a little bit about and what ultimately got you into design leadership?
There's a 6-year moment in a person's career where you hit this crossroads. Do you want to be designing things, or do you want to be sort of setting the vision for others? Do you have a propensity for leadership and management? And I sort of reached that point early, only because of what I was thrown into as a graduate student when I was asked as part of my assistantship to run this Red Cross project. I had to manage it, as well as, lead a team, and it was all students, to design all the parts and pieces for this mobile blood collection system that we were doing for them. And I found that I really liked that part. And I worked many hours, trying to keep the thing going. And eventually we had the opportunity to transition it from the experimental and developmental phase into operation at the American Red Cross. And they actually created a job for me at the national headquarters outside in Washington, D.C., to come and bring it to life. And so I kind of didn't have a choice. I went there by myself. I was a punk. I didn't know what I didn't know. I still don't know what I don't know. And I had to implement this thing. I got beaten up pretty bad because people will take credit for things that are successful that somebody else did real fast, and they'll run like crazy from something that failed. Well, everybody was trying to take credit for the work that I was doing. And there were people, of course, much more experienced than me. And in that environment, there were a lot of former military officers in second careers. So that was a challenge, and I had to learn fast. But I was immediately thrust into this role of having to be a leader, a design leader. I had to bring things to life and be able to tell stories and communicate and start traveling all over the country. And I was, 25 years old.
And you've been at, some very cool brands, from IDSA to Motorola to Newell Brands and P&G. Just kind of curious how those jumps kind of happened.
It's the story of life, my friend. Some of it was absolute serendipity, and I went, ass backwards into an opportunity. Some of it was headhunters, search consultants, some of whom became lifetime friends. Some of it was I realized that I kind of reached the natural end of what I was doing and I had to start looking. So it was a real combination. In two occasions, I guess you would say, it was because I lost my job and I had to leverage my network. And I want to talk about networks at some point. I had to leverage my network to find my way into what the next adventure was going to be.
Let's jump into that, because I think that is really interesting. Networking and personal branding and thought leadership and that type of thing. I feel like a lot of the times networking is something that people don't think about until it's a little bit too late or later on in their career, when it's incredibly important to do early on. Or how did you start thinking about networking earlier in your career?
So this is a really important story arc that I want to share and may take a couple minutes. I've always had a propensity to be active in professional circles. I joined the IDSA while I was still in school. I was in a student chapter. I didn't realize that it was a heck of a lot more than learning from others. What I realized, and when I give a lecture or when I teach, I will say, if you don't know the person next to you, you better meet them now, because someday they may save your life. Fast forward 20 years ago, when I did lose a job, when the company decided to source things in China and Mexico, they didn't need an innovator. All of a sudden you're a bad fit. I realized that what saved my life was that I had 350 people, because I kept track, that I could call. One, because I knew them, or two, because we were also members of the Industrial Designers Society of America. We're also members of the Design Management Institute. And it gave me a way to open the door and say, hey, I need a hand. And that networking is how I found my way to other opportunities. At the same time, in business, developing a broad network gives you connections that you can leverage for the benefit of the work you're doing and for the company you're in, or for the customer you're trying to serve, or Wall Street, if you're a stock company. That has always served me well. And I've done the best work in my career, and frankly, I hope my teams have too, when I could look to another world, not my own, for the answer, and leverage people who are in a different walk of life or in a different dynamic than I'm in. And, none of us know what we don't know. So networking, one, can save your backside. When I lost my job 20 years ago, I had 2 kids in college, and my wife had an agent in New York that brought her work. The agent retired all of a sudden. We had just moved into a new house in a city I won't mention, and hadn't even unpacked yet. And suddenly the company changed directions, and I was out on the street, figuratively. And so, what are you going to do? You can, go cry, go have a few beers, but then, I made finding a new job my job. And I got up in the morning and I took a shower and I got dressed and I sat at a desk and I organized my day and I worked on networking and figuring out how I was going to find my next adventure. So the networks have served me well. And today, the job that I have at Mount Mary University as Chief Transformation and Innovation Officer working for the president is to leverage the 4,000 connections I have on LinkedIn, leverage the relationships that I have locally, regionally, globally, to help the university to bring all kinds of new things in and exposure to our diverse young women, to help them prepare for practice in ways they never dreamed. And so it's still critical, and I'm still building it, and I'm still in networking groups.
What are some key lessons you've learned throughout your career that you would like to pass on to others?
The number one secret weapon is to learn how to make it about everybody else and not yourself and not your team. If you can help others solve the problems that they have, and do it successfully using the tools you know how to use to solve their problems, they'll start to tell your story for you, and you don't have to as much. Back in the day, Schwartz would run around waving his hands over his head with his hair on fire, talking about how great he was and how great design was and all the awards we won, and this is what I'm going to do for your business and blah, 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 blah. And not realize that I wasn't listening. I was telling. And I got a good swift kick in the backside from one CEO especially, and I'll tell this story briefly. And it was actually when I went to GE Healthcare. There were others before that helped me learn this, but I learned it best in GE Healthcare. I was making the rounds of the C-suites when I first got there as the design leader, and I met with this one guy, and I started to talk about all this wonderful stuff that I did at Procter & Gamble, and what my team and I were going to do for him and his business. And I could see he was getting mad. I mean, his face was getting red. I saw he clenched his fist, and I'm thinking, I need to shut my mouth. But I didn't, and I kept going. And if I can use a little colorful language, because he did, it's a podcast, right? He suddenly pounded his fist on the table, and he said to me, "God damn it, Schwartz, you don't get it. You don't get it. I don't have time for this fluffy bunny shit. I need cash now. Do you understand me? I need cash now. Now, if you can come back here and tell me how am I going to get cash now, then I'll listen to this crap. Otherwise, get the hell out of my office." And he threw me out, because what I was doing was not asking him, what are the biggest challenges in your business? In what ways might we? How can we? And I didn't make it about him and his business. I made it about me and my team. Now, I knew better at that late, state in my career, but I forgot. And he beat the hell out of me for that. So fast forward 3 years later, I realized that I had gone down the wrong path with this guy. He comes running into the studio yelling, "Schwartz, where the hell are you? Where are the signature elements on that design in my product line?" Obviously, we had flipped him, and now he was coming to me looking for design, because we realized that we needed to serve his needs, help solve his problems, and then that would endear us to the business, to him as a leader, and he would tell others about how we helped him solve a business challenge he had. The other thing that we did, and maybe you and I talked about this once before on our first conversation, but when I went especially into GE, having come from Procter & Gamble, I started to say we're global design, organic drivers of strategic business growth. And people would look at me like I was from Pluto. And they would roll their eyes and they would laugh, because design was seen as a valued creative resource. It really was. But it wasn't seen as strategic. It wasn't seen as a driver of organic business growth. Nobody kind of had that frame in their head. And so we basically took that ground. And the more we talked about it, the more it started to become true, more the team began to behave differently. And we began to, from the way we delivered and the way we carried ourselves, showing up as business people in the context of our discipline every single day. Not everybody did that, but that was the idea, the aspiration, that we began to form business partnerships rather than be receivers of projects. And, sort of by the end, we were starting to see with some of the verticals, some strands of DNA that were getting into the business that had to do with design. Now, I learned this because of what I learned at Procter & Gamble and Newell Brands before that, and Motorola before that, and my time in Washington before that. And it's iterative. It builds on itself. And sometimes you jump backwards and forwards. You fall backwards and leap forward. It's messy. It's not linear. And I am not a linear guy.
That's a great story. And I think completely agree with the point of how at some point in your career, these lessons come full circle and you realize, man, like what I went through 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever it might be, like I actually learned something from that that's just kind of resurfacing and helping me today.
Even when I've had the honor to be able to teach, as I was doing at Northwestern University, in a graduate school there, I would come away from, my courses having learned more than what I contributed, I felt like sometimes, just because of the dialogue that happened with the students, the life experiences of all these, professionals in that case that came from all over the world to be in that program. Learning can come from anywhere, and it's continuous. It never stops. And I still do stupid stuff that I regret. And I still don't get it. I still have to remind myself I don't know what I don't know, and I can't assume. And there's a certain level of humility you have to maintain. The best leaders that I've ever seen, and I'm talking about, the chair people, the CEOs, the best leaders I've ever worked around or with, had a certain level of humility, even though you wouldn't want to mess with them. They would be caring and demanding. A phrase I learned in P&G, how to be caring and demanding.
I love that. Okay, so moving on here, can you recall a moment in your career that significantly influenced your path? And how did that moment ultimately change the path that you were on?
Okay, so there's a Rosetta Stone for me. And it happened at Rhode Island School of Design with the late, great Professor Mark Harrison, who was the chair of the Industrial Design Department there, and had the most influence on my life. And I talk about this anytime I get the chance. The most influence on my life of anybody except maybe my parents. This guy believed in doing design in a strong social context, and he brought work to the program that allowed us to do that, like for the American Red Cross, for example. He was doing things in the 60s and in the 70s that didn't have names yet, like universal design, contextual and ethnographic research, task analyses. He showed us how to not just ask, but to observe. He showed us that there was a difference between what people say and what they do before that became common in design thinking. I learned much later that there's actually a technical name for say versus do called the zone of supposed paradox. I love that. But what I learned from this guy not only is to see how I could pursue a career in a strong social context, but I also started to learn about thinking about others, thinking about who the subject of the design really was, how to walk in their shoes. It's the stuff that that design thinking thinks it's solved, that this guy was doing decades and decades ago. And incredible influence. And I've always found a way to see where the social context or the social meaning was in any job I've had, even though in some cases it was difficult.
I think that's super interesting. And really, I think that's great. The zone of supposed paradox, but also finding something that is important to you and really resonates with you, and finding it how to kind of build that as a theme or make it part of what you're doing.
When I went to Procter & Gamble, a lot of jobs I had, it was pretty easy. But when I went to Procter & Gamble, I said, where am I going to find that here? They make soap, they make feminine products, batteries, Swiffer. There's thousands of products that they make. It's an incredible company. But what I realized is that the company was all about moments of care. In the simplest form, how do you help a 5-year-old boy who's never seen a toothbrush in South America learn how to brush his teeth and keep doing it? How do you help a person who washes their clothes in a wash tub in a developing country recapture time? There was all kinds of, how do you help a mom anywhere help to develop their child, not just wrap them in a diaper? There were all manner of ways of thinking about what these products did in everyday life that were meaningful. And in some cases in evolved markets, and in some cases in developing markets. It was really rich. At first I thought, well, I'm taking this job because they offered me one, but I don't really understand how I'm going to find my context here. And man, I did.
It's, I think, one of those things, regardless of what we're doing, kind of looking at it and finding what is truly the meaning of where we are and how we think about things and and what we want to design and what we want to design for. And quite often you walk into a situation, in my experience, you're not quite sure of that. And you realize that there's a lot of good and meaningful work you can actually do.
Homework assignment for anybody listening to this, if they don't know about Simon Sinek and the original TED Talk he gave about why. He would say that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. That was his core quote. And he gave he gives examples of how, Apple wanted to change the world. They didn't want to make computers. Steve Jobs wanted to change the world. That was his why. That was his aspiration.
I want to move on here, just thinking about skills and insights. What specific skills or mindsets have been crucial for you in navigating your career twists and turns?
Frankly, it's all about people. And my friend Mauro Porcini at PepsiCo talks about people in love with people, and he's not wrong. As a leader, as an influencer, you first have to learn that if people don't trust and respect you, they're not going to want to work with you. I have faced criticism from people who like to leave trails of bodies behind them to get shit done. Throughout my career, I faced criticism for caring more about my team than myself. I've just always felt that building trusting relationships has helped me to implement strategy and the pragmatics of business far easier when I didn't take the time, the investment to do that. And there are some who, will say, I don't have time for that fluffy bunny shit. The product is more important than the people. They can go pound salt in my book. And I managed to find a successful path with lots of cobblestones and being run over by buses like everybody else. But I always tried to focus on who is it that's in front of me. It's not if somebody's acting out, who is an employee, and I learned this the hard way too. It's not about what's wrong with you. It's about what happened to you to cause that behavior. That's like trauma-informed education. There's a whole field of that now. And so, some of the key things were some would say soft qualities, but I see them as the hard ones. Yeah, I talked about one key one, making it about everybody else. I haven't talked about, though, recruiting the army you don't control. As a design leader, there's a certain number of you in design, and there's thousands of them. You're never going to scale as large as marketing or engineering, that sort of thing, or the finance people. They're always going to have more. The question is, how can you use the tools you have, make it about them, invite them into your tent? We always did that with design thinking. We had huge design thinking practices in most of the companies that I worked in. We would find that people would take to that, even the tough guys who stood there in a corner with their arms folded. In the beginning, you couldn't get rid of them. At the end, well, they'd come back and be coaches for somebody else. So suddenly you're starting to recruit this army you don't really control, and people who want to pitch in because they like working the way you work, and they see how you're helping them solve problems that they're otherwise not able to solve with some of the tools they used. You're sharing the tools you have. So recruiting the army you don't control. The other one, and I've made a career out of this, is being a little subversive with goodness in your heart. You cannot be an innovator. You can't be a creative leader. You can't be a leader of any kind, because everybody's responsible for innovation. It doesn't matter your discipline, unless you're willing to take risks. But you don't do it because you're arrogant or because you're a jerk. You do it because you have goodness in your heart. You're thinking about the customer, the consumer, your investors, whomever it might be. And I found that ultimately to be valuable if I can stick to that. And in the end, if you're not willing to take a bloody nose, then you might as well go home. Because eventually, if you do it for the right reasons, those bloody noses become badges of honor. And that's another one of the big tenets that I walk away from, certainly a lot of parts of my career, where I did take lots of blood. I've always taken bloody noses. I'm still getting bloody noses. But if I'm doing it in the right way, it actually can help to develop respect in two directions. And it actually can help you get things done. And even though you can get called names. I've been called a cowboy, a loose cannon, a self promoter, the guy who works in the country club, this kind of stuff. But ultimately, when you're delivering on promises, you're stretching the envelope. You're giving them things they never dreamed about were possible. Suddenly, those become really powerful tools.
You just said so many things that I just love and I think are great takeaways. One, you can never over index on people. I think, I love the concept of recruit the army you can't control. I think that likewise with be submersive with the goodness in your heart and how you kind of tied that up or teed that up with, how you think about innovation and be okay taking the bloody nose.
You're going to get it whether you want it or not. The question is, what do you do with it? Is it a teachable moment? Is it deliberate? Do you have an idea in mind? And I'm not saying as an individual, but with a team about the consequences that are likely to occur. And then, it might go bad and you could lose your job, or it might come back around and be a really good thing.
Is there anything you would have done differently in your career?
Taking better care of myself, try to keep, the holy grail of work-life balance, whatever that means. I remember when I got diamond status in the Hilton Honors Program, and I bragged about, I got diamond status. And my sister said to me, and that's a good thing because you've been away from home 90 nights this year, and being real passionate about what you're doing is great. But you have to find a way to maintain a marriage, maintain your family, pay attention to your kids. I feel like I did a reasonable job at that, except when I didn't, because the demands of the roles that I had, you can get lost in. One of the things that I always tried to hold on to is that you can have my head and my hands and some of my heart, but you can't have my soul. And why would you work for anybody who wants your soul? And I remember in one circumstance, and I got to be careful how I tell this. I was with a bunch of executives at a dinner, and they had a motivational speaker come in. And at the end of the dinner, he gets up and he's starting to do his thing. And he wanted us to all stand up, close our eyes, lock arms, and say, I am, and then the company name. I am, and then the company name. And I thought, that's bullshit. And I started to say in the same tone of voice, I am Bob. I am Bob. And my colleagues are elbowing me. Shut up, you're going to get fired. You're going to get fired. Well, no, I am not that. I work for you. I'll give you everything I've got. I'll give you my head. I'll give you my hands. I'll give you a piece of my heart. But I am not giving you my soul. And that was a bloody nose I took. Ultimately, I mean, my bosses were all there, and I was getting the stink eye. But ultimately, I think over time, they got it.
I was going to ask you as a follow-up question before you gave that answer. I was going to ask you what advice you would give to someone earlier in their career who are still trying to figure things out. Maybe you just answered that question.
Yeah, hold on to your soul, brothers and sisters. Don't let that go. Always, A.G. Lafley, who was the chairman of Procter & Gamble at the time I was there, he came in to talk to us a couple times, but he would tell us that even then, as the chairman of a global corporation, he still had Post-it notes on his mirror to remind himself that he had value and to remind himself that he needed to maintain a certain quality of humility in order to do his job, even though he had to be a tough guy and people were beating him up all the time for the pressures that he was under. Those were stops along the way where I learned lessons like that. And, it goes back to what's your why. And that why is going to change over time based on circumstances. And at some point, I hope, listeners don't lose their job. Remember, you got a network, and remember to make it about everybody else.
A few last questions for you. One, what do you think the future of design looks like?
This is almost cliche and it happened in a minute. Artificial intelligence is changing everything, has changed, will change. We don't even know what we don't know about the impact it's going to have. I look at it as the same tool as as a microwave oven used to be, as a mobile phone used to be, as a pocket calculator used to be, and everybody freaked out when those things appeared. You couldn't bring a pocket calculator into your 6th grade arithmetic class, and now it's an essential tool and has been for 40 years. I'm trying to think about it that way. It's a tool. There will be bad actors who use it for evil, and the good actors better not stop and be afraid of it, because the bad actors aren't. And I think it's the same thing in design. If in design we don't embrace these emerging technologies that are accelerating exponentially, the bad actors are going to overtake the profession. I think the boundaries are blurred completely. They've been blurring for years, but the differences between physical and digital design, there is no difference, because the two have to be created together. One of my biggest frustrations in business was the throw it over the wall syndrome, where we would do the physical design of a device or a product, and then somebody else would do the software and the UI, and the two things mismatched. It's like, I'm making this up. There's an anesthesia machine in a hospital, and the people doing the software used an icon of a triangle on the screen that meant one thing, and then the physical designers had a connector on the side that was triangular shaped that meant another thing. And imagine the potential for chaos that could cause by the user. So those things all have to be designed together. It always starts with the human beings, or whatever the environment is you're applying it to. You can't leap to the idea. Now I'm giving a design thinking lecture. You have to start with the problem you're trying to solve and the discovery of that. And companies don't want to spend money on that largely.
Favorite quote?
So this quote is attributed to a dear friend and colleague, Lawrence Murphy, also known as Murph, who was the chief designer at GE Healthcare. He worked there for 37 years. He's now retired. A brilliant guy. How he survived with the personality he had, I don't know. But he would say, if you're not having any fun, it's at least half your fault. And when he retired, we actually, in the US studio, we put this in giant type on the wall up by the ceiling. If you're not having any fun, it's at least half your fault. It goes to your why. It goes to your work-life balance. It goes to meaningful work. It goes to making it about everybody else. And I just love it for that.
And lastly, where can people find you?
They can certainly find me on LinkedIn. I'm not the only Bob Schwartz in the universe, but I'm listed as Bob Schwartz.
This was great. I know I took a lot out of it. I think there's a lot of really great takeaways, and look forward to getting the show out there. And I really appreciate you taking the time today.
I appreciate being your first guest. If you're asking me to do this.
Hey, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed our content today, please like, subscribe, and comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time.